Well, I'm really pleased to be here, and thanks everyone for tuning in today. I'm going to be talking about the research that I've been conducting for over 20 years now. I have explored this one issue of children's reports. Well, actually, I changed the title of my talk. I normally give a talk related to children's reports, but more accurately, today we're going to be talking about children's reports, but also adults' reports for childhood events. And so with delay, sometimes, adults come forward many years later to make reports of events. So we'll talk about that a little bit today as well. I guess just a little bit about my background. I actually started in college working at a police department. I worked at a police department as a college level intern for several years during undergrad. At the time, I planned on being an attorney, and I'll make sure everyone can hear me okay. Yes, so I planned on being an attorney, and then so along the way, I found out you can actually study the law in psychology. And when I was working at the police department, taking police reports, I became really fascinated by the fact that, I noticed if I asked people questions in different ways, they would give different types of answers. And so if I would ask somebody, for example, say they're describing a suspect, I would say, what did he look like? And they may say, I don't know, I had no idea. And if I said something like, well, was he taller than you or shorter than you? Just the different ways of questioning tended to provide very different types of answers. And so at any rate, I ended up then going out west to the University of Wyoming for grad school. And I'm an experimental psychologist, and specifically developmental psychology. So I do all research. I'm not in clinical practice. After Wyoming, I went to Johns Hopkins, and I was in the child and adolescent psychiatry division for 4 years, doing research on forensic interviews with children and also examining atypical populations, such as children with autism and anxiety disorders. And so that's a bit about my background. I publish in my area. I also am pretty active in statistics and have written a couple stats books, which tend to make most of the non-researchers kind of shudder. But let's see, what else about me? I don't know, I'll end at least 10 minutes early and we can just do some questions. And honestly, if you have questions as we go, please feel free to chime in as well. I'd be happy to kind of veer from the plan here of these PowerPoint. I guess one other thing I should mention about myself is I've given quite a bit of expert testimony. And so I'm going to talk to you about some of the cases that I've worked on. And I don't know if any of you also do expert testimony, or maybe if you would like to get into expert testimony, I'd be happy to talk about any of that too. Or, if you want to discuss something about your own experiences, I'd be happy to do that. So here's what I figured we'll do today. I thought we'd talk about differences that I find myself explaining to attorneys quite a bit when I take cases, where sometimes I get calls from attorneys where they want me to assist on the case, and often they don't really know what researchers like myself can do on the case. They're kind of looking to me to say, well, look at my case. Can you tell me whether this child is telling the truth or not? And I explain why I can't really get to that issue. And that has to do with what at least a colleague of mine, one of my co-authors, Steve Ceci, and I wrote a paper a number of years ago where we differentiated between the terms of reliability, credibility, and competence. And so the heart of what we can do as experts really falls into that. And again, everything that I'll be talking about in terms of the statements that I make about child witnesses or memory for childhood is based on research. And like I said, I'll kind of weave in the legal cases as well. So this is a topic that I love. I feel really lucky to study it. I went into this area because I really love what I do. But I also think it's an important area because the stakes are so high in cases involving children. And I don't know if everyone who's sitting in here today, if you work with children, if you all work with children or adolescents, but even if you don't, even if you work with adult populations, I think that people will often run into issues that have to do with child witnesses. Even if you just have an adult patient, for example, who comes in and says, I'm really stressed out, I'm getting divorced, I'm worried my ex-husband, my soon-to-be ex-husband could have done something, I'm worried about my kid because of this. I think these issues come up. And with the cases that I work on, definitely just very high stakes. I'm working on a number of death penalty cases, for example, in different states where the child was the only surviving witness, basically. So incidents like there's a home intrusion during the night, and let's say mom and the other sibling are killed, and the child, was hiding underneath a bed allegedly during the incident. How can we interview those children? I put a case of the intoxicated police officer. That's kind of what I remember that case by, a case where a guy who was a cop at the time, his daughter came to allege that one weekend during visitation, he was drunk and basically just went into her room, never had tried touching her inappropriately in the past and sexually assaulted her. That case, besides the fact that the guy was a cop and so he would lose his career, it was a life without parole case. And often those cases are life without parole in many states. So in the state that this police officer case took place, it was life without parole because the guy had allegedly gone into the room on 2 occasions. So it counted as 2 incidents. And in fact, that was a case that I did not take. I consulted with a defense attorney on it, and I felt that the presentation was a clean presentation. It was one that I didn't have any issues with. And I felt that my testimony would have been better for the prosecution, quite frankly, than for the defense. And in fact, the guy was sentenced to life with no parole. A case that I think of as God's messenger case that involved a mother and then her mom, so the grandmother of some kids, another life with no parole case. And with that case, it involved, a lot of these cases are really long, just tangled webs. In that particular case, the grandmother basically felt that she had divine powers to communicate with God, and felt that God was telling her that her son-in-law was sexually abusing his daughter. And also at 12 months old, when the little girl, the daughter, was 12 months old, allegedly the grandma was changing the little girl's diaper. And when grandma said, when the diaper came off, the little girl put her hands to her private part area and said, "Dada." And at that point, the grandmother really became convinced that he was sexually abusing that little girl. I see some strange looks. And so that brings up a great, I think, a point. I can tell, I think why you're making a strange look really is, well, what would you expect out of a 12-month-old? What is developmentally appropriate? And so back when I was at Johns Hopkins, I taught a resident seminar to people who were the child and adolescent psychiatry residents and on typical development. And so in that case, I was able to say, look, 12-month-olds, like, they have phonemes that emerge in their speech, and Dada is one of the first ones. And there's no reason to think a 12-month-old was trying to communicate something like that. So sometimes these sorts of issues come up of, well, what would you expect to see at a certain age? And topics that I think you discuss in medicine quite a bit, which is what is like the specificity and the sensitivity of certain behaviors in indicating that something took place. And so those are the topics that we'll talk about over like the next 40 or so minutes. So I've talked to a lot of attorneys now, and I've taken quite a few cases as an expert witness. And so I wanted to give you, and I realize you all may have worked on plenty of cases that are like this, or you work with kids, so you may be well aware of this, but this is what I tend to see in my cases. And this is also, this kind of presentation is why I think child sexual abuse allegations are particularly difficult cases. And so when I talk to attorneys, they tend to tell me the same thing. They tell me, oh, these cases are just so difficult. I would rather have a murder case to work on because at least there's evidence. So what we tend to have in child sexual abuse cases, often other types of maltreatment cases, but particularly allegations of sexual abuse, is that the initial outcry takes place in an informal setting. And I'll come back to the importance of that and kind of what we can do with that. But that complicates things when the initial outcry comes out first to people other than a trained forensic interviewer. Often there's delays of some length of time, could be days, could be years, that are alleged to have taken place in between the alleged event in question and then the child coming forward to where the case is brought forward to authorities. Typically, as I guess I would imagine you are all well aware, there tends not to be any physical evidence, no corroborative evidence. And so basically it's one person's word against another. It's one person, the child saying that this took place, and then a defendant who is saying, this is crazy, nothing like this ever happened. We also tend to have repeated interviews. And when I say interviews, I'm really meaning any conversation that takes place with the child, whether that be in kind of an informal interview that took place with whomever the child told in the informal setting, as well as in the formal setting. We often have interviews that are done with, say, social services, cop who responds to the scene, and then the CAC interviewer, and maybe a second CAC interviewer, and then the child goes for a medical, and often interviews take place then. I find in many cases too, the prosecutor talks to the child and has, a visit with the child before the child testifies. So it makes it pretty difficult to tease these sorts of cases apart. And by the way, excuse me, if anyone can hear snoring, my French bulldog is in the background, so I apologize. I have these headphones on, hoping you can't hear it, but I need to get the noise canceling ones. So at least I'll share with you the way that I assess these sorts of allegations as an expert witness, and then, maybe you have a different way. But at least what I've come to see over the past 20 or so years acting as an expert is that when we're assessing allegations, credibility, competence, reliability are the things we can think about. But I put the little stop, yield, and go sign next to each of those concepts, because as an expert or in assessing the case, credibility is something that really I cannot speak to as the expert. And there's a research literature to say why. That's not entirely true about, I can't say anything, right? So credibility, how credible is it? How detailed, consistent, plausible? Does the person have a motive for deception? Those are things really ultimately that have to do with what in the legal system is the ultimate issue. So credibility is up for the jurors to decide. And as the expert, I'm not, in most jurisdictions, you're not allowed to even opine on the credibility. Now, And the reason I mentioned there's a research literature behind why I tend not to really get into credibility issues much. And that is because when a child is making a false statement, whether it be that it's an intentional false statement, i.e. a lie, or that we've suggestively interviewed them. So we've put social pressure on them and they've come to, incorporate that misinformation, and maybe they even think that event took place. When you compare true event reports to false event reports, they look very similar. I'll show you some testimony transcripts from some experts who've opined that if a kid is making a false event report, either they're lying or they've been pressured, that you'll be able to tell the difference. But there have been lots and lots of studies now that in fact show that's just not true. Now, you can have a false statement that's so egregiously false, it's just completely impossible. So if I said to you, for example, that I took a spaceship to work today, you could say that's so implausible, it must be false. You can flag it as false. But just because, on the other hand, that the statement is plausible, I could tell you I drove my blue Toyota to work today. So just because it is plausible, in fact, does not mean it's true. So you might be able to flag it. I didn't take a spaceship here, but I also didn't take a blue Toyota here, right? So that's why, from a research perspective, we can't really say a whole lot. There are no good, reliable credibility assessments really that allow us to reliably tease out deception unless it's really egregious. Competence is the child's abilities to remember, encode, store, and retrieve what took place to them, their language ability as well. To what extent can they communicate it? And then reliability is what I think the heart of most examinations of child witnesses end up being. And reliability is the context under which the allegations unfolded. So to what extent is the context under which the child's allegations arose consistent with research that has shown to produce reliable statements, trustworthy statements, versus to what extent did the child's statements emerge in a way that we know from the research contaminates or distorts the child's reports. And I also added to that timeline. So the biggest thing that I do as an expert then isn't to go nitpick through a child's statements and try to say like, oh, she gave something that was inconsistent there. That's not what I do. Instead, I look at anybody and everyone who may have talked to the child from the time of the alleged events in question into the present. And did the statement evolve? Did it change? And if so, did it change in accord with certain things happening, with certain people who had certain beliefs? So I'm going to parcel a little bit of this out now and talk about it in terms of kind of how and what we can do. And I should add, by the way, that I would be more than happy to share these slides with you if anyone, if that could be of benefit to anyone else, send them along and they could pass them along. But what I'm going to show you now is, I guess it's a decision tree. It's a decision tree that I have found to be pretty useful in my own conceptualization as an expert witness. And it also turns out to be pretty handy in conceptualizing the research that goes along with child cases. And so in reality, when we're either assessing an abuse case as a clinician or evaluating a case as an expert witness, at the end of the day, we want to know, did abuse happen or did it not happen, right? But unless you have a crystal ball, which I do not have, we can't just look, right, again, to these like characteristics of what the child is saying and how they're saying it. So instead, what I'll argue is that we kind of have to work kind of from like down up to answer these questions of did abuse happen, yes or no. So you'll see underneath each of the possibilities of abuse happened, abuse didn't happen, that there are two possibilities. Either the child tells or the child does not tell. So if we have abuse really did take place and the child tells, the research literature that would be applicable there is to what extent can kids actually remember things that have happened to them, traumatic things, memory for trauma, memory with delay, right? So the literature on children's memory for traumatic events is relevant there. Now, one of the things, the reasons why we can't do just like an analysis of the content of the narratives to tell whether an event did or didn't take place is that when an event really does happen and the child is remembering it and telling, providing a narrative about it, we don't remember everything perfectly. And so just because a child gives some inconsistent statements doesn't mean it's untrue. In fact, we expect inconsistencies. And what the research has been finding over the past 20 years is that when you compare true event reports to false event reports, often the false event reports actually look as good or most often better than the true event reports in terms of the characteristics that you would expect would typify a good event report. So things like embellishments and details and consistencies, things like that. And if you think about it, the reason why I think that that's the case, that false event reports do look so good, is that in studies where we coach a child to lie, let's say we say to the child, lie and say you were attacked by a German Shepherd when you were 5 years old, their memory of what they've just been instructed to lie about is pretty fresh. They're being instructed to lie about an event right before they go on stage, basically, to tell the lie, or pretty soon, before. Whereas with the true event reports, one thing we see is that even traumatic memories fade and deteriorate, right? Just like non-traumatic memories. There's nothing all that magical really about memory for trauma or traumatic event memory. So it's going to fade and deteriorate somewhat just like regular memories. If we have suggestively talked to a child, so we said deception, right, where we coach them, we could also implant a memory in them that they were attacked by a German Shepherd. And when we compare the suggestively induced memory, false memory, to the true event report, the suggestively induced memories also tend to look better than the true event reports. So unlike what I think a lot of attorneys expect, like, oh, there's an inconsistency, doesn't that mean that it's false? Well, yes, I wouldn't expect them to one day to say my grandpa did it and another day say it was my uncle, but peripheral details, you're going to expect inconsistencies. A topic that I've published quite a bit on is the topic of abuse happened and the child does not tell. You might be thinking to yourself, how can you do research on that? And why would we really know or care? But this issue of if abuse happened, to what extent do kids come forward and tell others is a really important topic, as it turns out. Gets lots of attention in the courtroom. So I'll touch on that as well, on the research about if in fact a child really has been abused, to what extent do they come forward and tell others versus do they delay, deny, or recant abuse? And then we've got this abuse did not happen. So most kids are going to fall into abuse did not happen, thankfully, and that the child does not tell, right? I'm not sure if y'all are aware of David Finkelhor's work. He's in New Hampshire. David Finkelhor has done a lot on prevalence, incidence and prevalence of child abuse, as well as just child victimization across the board. And Finkelhor's large-scale epidemiology studies find that we've actually seen quite a reduction in child sexual abuse over the last 20 years. And we've seen an increase in disclosure. So just something to kind of mull over a little bit. Of course, COVID may have messed all of that up, but those have been the trends in the last 20 years. So most of what I'm talking about today, by the way, I really am focusing on sexual abuse, and I should probably say that a bit more, although I think the same trends hold true of physical abuse. Most of what I'm talking about pertains to physical abuse as well. But most of the research focused probably too much on sexual abuse, given the prevalence rates of physical abuse. Like physical abuse, is obviously of concern as well. But I think the focus has largely been on sexual abuse for a couple reasons, but one of which is that physical abuse can often involve corroborative evidence. And so, like, you can have a broken arm or something like that to work with. But I do think that I wish researchers in my area would focus more on physical abuse. Maybe that's a good discussion topic. Before I move on and I'll start talking more about like the research, I wanted just to add this little bit beneath these different possibilities. So we have abuse happened, abuse didn't happen. So abuse didn't happen, the child tells. There's two main reasons why a child would end up telling, would end up making a false statement or a false allegation of abuse. And we've touched on those already. One is suggestibility. And so they've succumbed, let's say, to social pressure, or just like somebody thought they were abused and questioned them. And then the other one is deception. So this is where the child, by definition, deceptive statements or lies are intentionally motivated. They're intentional. You're giving false information with the intent of like manipulating another person's belief, right? Most of my work has focused on, in terms of false motives or underlying driving force of false statements, it focuses on suggestibility. All right, so I'm going to give a good bit of focus now to false concerns of abuse. I'm curious what everyone would think about to what extent are false concerns of abuse an issue. And maybe I'm mentioning too many areas for, hey, we can open this up for discussion, but of why y'all would think, why would false concerns come up, or in your practice, if you've seen or suspected that false concerns have come up. In the work that I've done with all these cases, I see two main sources. I thought I'd divide up the discussion in the research presentation into false concerns that we get with child cases, and then false historic claims of child abuse, because there's overlaps in those cases, but they're pretty different phenomenons, I think. I should mention too, of course, there's loads of true cases, and true cases are, we know that child abuse really happens, and that, it leads to negative effects, and it's a worldwide problem, right? But of course, even though we know that, even though we know there's an unfortunate number of true maltreatment cases, we really want to be able to accurately classify them. We want to make sure we get it right? We don't want to treat somebody for abuse or handle it as an abuse case where in fact it hasn't. I've been seeing, though, more and more cases where I'm concerned they could be false cases, and I think it's because human cognition is fallible. So if you look at these two drawings, these are drawings from a child who's about 4.5. And if you're looking at them as somebody who works with maltreated kids, or let's say a mom comes to you and shows you these drawings and says, hey, my 4-year-old came home from her visit with my ex and ex's boyfriend, And he came home making all these drawings, and they seem a little phallic-like to me. And, I see this liquid kind of coming out of these phallic sorts of, symbols that are, or things that are by its crotch. And what could this liquid be that's coming out of it? That the explanation for why false cases, I think, tend to come forward is because we develop suspicions that may not be valid. And once we develop those suspicions, we can basically fall in this path of like a snowball bias effect. So our perceptions are not always like objectively what is actually there. And here's another example of that, of this fact that human perception isn't just, we're not AI, but rather we interpret things differently according to different contexts. There was just a 2009 report by a committee for the National Academy of Forensic Sciences, where it was basically a white paper that was calling for a complete revamping of forensic sciences, because we as humans can be so biased in how we interpret things. So if you're given information about, hey, I think this partial fingerprint matches this guy for this bombing, and this guy happens to have been sending money to terrorist groups, right? We know that those forensic scientists tend to be biased by information, contextual information, just like we are in these old school cognitive tasks. What you see this, basically this symbol as right here is going to vary according to the context in which you view it. So do you see it as a 13 or do you see it as a B? Again, it's going to vary with the context. So if, again, going back here, if you're suspecting abuse, if you think that your ex is a really bad person or whatever, we may interpret things that we wouldn't otherwise. So these are actually drawings from my now 19-year-old back when he was 4. I found that he went through a phase developmentally with his drawings where, they're just not very good at their fine motor behavior, and everything was kind of coming home, at least to the dirty-minded adult, of looking like penises for a while. At least that's what it looked like to me. And then some of them even look like, well, what is this liquid coming out? And so with this particular drawing, I asked my son, like, well, what is this? What is this stuff right here? And it was Spider-Man. And that's Spider-Man's webs, right? But we have to be careful. We have to be careful of kind of getting that train in motion. So misunderstandings, human cognition is fallible. When you think about how most people get their information, it's TikTok. No, just kidding. Well, this is actually from TikTok. Looking at, how do most people get their information now? They do a Google search. They're on TikTok. Things like that. So I looked up how many views were present on TikTok according to different hashtags related to like recovered memory, suppressed memory, dissociative amnesia, trauma, EMDR, things that I'm seeing in my cases that I believe are associated with false memories and claims. And what you can see is that these concepts have billions of hits. So I'm a researcher on child's memory. I can tell you that billions of people are not reading my studies, but they are looking at TikTok quite a bit, as you can see. And so much like what we saw in the 1980s, for those of you who are old enough to remember back then, is that there was a huge movement of false, what we believe to have been false memory in the 1980s. We know much of the allegations, in fact, were false in the 80s. We had a huge wave of it, and also of allegations of satanic ritualistic abuse in the 80s. Researchers like Elizabeth Loftus started conducting studies, and many other people. And then repressed memory kind of went away. We didn't hear a whole lot about it for a while. but it's, I think, very much coming back. And I'm actually starting to investigate that now. Most of my work has been with kids or adolescents, but because I'm seeing so many claims of repressed memory now, I'm actually starting to investigate it. And I'll talk to you a bit about that. So I think the reasons for that we end up with false suspicions then for children and adolescents and adults, I mean, the underlying mechanisms have to do with the fact that human cognition and memory is fallible, but like the specific events for those different kind of age demographics are present a bit differently. So in young kids, I tend to see things like behavioral changes that the adult is worried about. So they'll say, well, my kid keeps touching his private parts, or a friend's private part, or their own private parts. Bedwetting seems to be a big one, for some reason, of parents thinking like, whoa, my kid is 6 and they're still wetting the bed, or like they stopped wetting the bed for 2 months and now they're wetting the bed again. But I've seen it all, trust me. And all these cases, I work on quite a few cases. I was on one case once where a therapist took a little girl out to a pond, handed the little girl a rock and said, pretend this is dad, right? Like, so mom and dad are like divorcing and they hate each other. So the therapist says to this little girl, pretend this is your dad. The little girl's standing next to a pond with a rock. And what does she do? But she throws the rock in the pond. I mean, who could possibly hold a rock next to a pond and not throw it in, right? Like, that's an affordance. But fear of loud noises has started some of my cases. I have a friend who's a teacher where I live who came to me asking me once, so I have this boy who's in 1st grade in my class, and he's terrified of toilets flushing. Do you think that that could be indicative of abuse? Am I a mandated reporter? And I was like, well, why would a toilet flushing be indicative of abuse? Like, you think he was being abused? Will they flush the toilet or what? And so if you look up the literature on child development, kids they don't like loud noises. Little kids don't like loud noises. I had a case once too that involved a kid being afraid of loud sneezes. And they actually came to claim that this kid was abused and that like the dad or boyfriend or whatever must have sneezed at the time, But kids are just developmentally, they're afraid they don't like loud noises. They don't like garbage trucks and things like that. Regressive behavior. Oh, my kid, they're going backwards, or just behavioral issues across the board. So I think there tends to be like a perfect storm in most cases where you've got a parent of a young kid who shows some behavior, but also that there's some kind of atmosphere of accusation where they also are thinking like, well, I'm thinking that like my grandmother's son who whatever, my kid was around is a guy who does bad stuff. In adolescence, I tend to see the cases cropping up if the kid is maybe suicidal, self-injury, things like that. I've been seeing quite a few cases when the mom and dad are still married, and like the profile I've been seeing is that the parents are also religious, where like maybe the dad's a minister. They've got 4 kids, all the kids are flourishing, they're all perfect, they're a perfect family. All of a sudden one of the girls is 15, she goes off the rails, so to speak, and therapist says, what in the world could this be? You come from this perfect family, all your siblings are perfect, we need to get to the bottom of what could have happened to you. Oh, self-injury, cutting, that's something I see a lot with my abused patients. So maybe, in fact, you were abused. Let's explore that. So I'm in the interest of wanting to be able to talk plenty and open things up to questions, I want to just hit on, I'm gonna move forward with some of the slides here and just say that let's talk about to what extent you can actually do that. Like, to what extent can you say you've got this self-injury And a lot of my abused patients have shown self-injury, and so that, must be indicative. But before I do that, before I talk about that, I hope that y'all are on the same page with me, that we know there's a lot of research, that there are ways that we can get people to have false memories or get them to agree that false events occurred. And I'd be happy to send publications on that. There's lots and lots of literature on that. But it's not just that kids, like a lot of the events that are used in studies that, where memory has been implanted, have been for things like magic shows, where a bunny is pulled out of a hat. But there's been plenty of research too that's on things like maybe that could approximate abuse, that involves like personal salient touch. There's some work even on memory for VCUG procedures, where the child undergoes a cath, and to what extent can you engender false memories on that. So again, I'd be happy to share this, but here's just a little sample of the types of things that researchers have found we can implant false memories on. So I'm hoping, if you're not familiar with this literature, that you'll at least take my word for it for now, with healthy skepticism, I suppose, that we can implant false memories in children. And then that's going to go back to this issue of, if we develop a suspicion, we think that a drawing, like something that's ambiguous, that isn't necessarily indicating abuse, took place, and we question the child about it, that we can end up, again, with this snowball bias effect. So the reason why we need to be really careful with these behavioral indicators, things like bedwetting or self-injury in adolescence, is that, I'm sure as you all know more than I do, that many kids who really were abused don't show any signs of it, that many people in general are resilient when they experience adverse events in their lives. And this is something, actually, I've seen attorneys attack kids on, defense attorneys, like, oh, this kid isn't broken enough, they're not damaged enough, they acted normal around this guy. Yeah, I mean, most abuse cases fly under the radar. So many abused kids don't show outward signs. And then many kids who show any given outward sign shows those signs for other reasons as well, right? So we don't just wet the bed because of abuse. In fact, I can't find any studies that really did examine bedwetting by abuse versus no abuse. But let's say anxiety, let's say self-injury. Even if there's more self-injury in sexually abused kids, loads of kids show self-injury who in fact were not abused, okay? And in fact, if you look at not just parents and what they report, I've seen many professionals hold these views as well, that these indicators are important in their assessment of abuse. But what those are not taking into account are base rates of abuse. And so here I have some testimony that was given by the expert for the prosecution in a case that I did recently, where the same nurse was saying with a 3-year-old that basically they opined that they felt there was evidence of abuse with this particular kid. And some of the information that they relied upon was that this child wet the bed. Well, I looked up what are the rates of wetting beds in 3-year-olds, and it was, I think, 50%, like 50% of 3-year-olds are still wetting the bed. I mean, none of my 3 kids were not wetting the bed at age 3. It's very genetic, right? So under cross-examination, though, the defense attorney said to the same nurse, well, are you aware that about half of 3-year-olds are still wetting the bed? Like, would that affect your opinion on the extent to which bedwetting is probative of abuse? And the nurse replied back, well, unfortunately, my scope is within the realm of sexual abuse and disclosure. And so she held fast to her opinion. I'm going to break that down for you, though, here as a researcher. Is, let's say, for a moment, this is what Bayesian statistics is all about. let's imagine that we have a 6% rate of abuse in 3-year-olds, which is high. I don't think it's actually that high. Like the rate that Finkelhor gets now is about 15% in anyone by age 18, but most of those cases occur when the kid is older. But let's just say that 6% of 3-year-olds are abused. We're being kind of overly generous in a way with that rate. So that would lead right to 6 abused kids. And let's say that, I don't know what percent of abused kids wet the bed. Well, there's not actually any literature on that. So let's give it a really high rate to, again, be generous for the sake of this nurse who testified that nocturnal enuresis is probative of abuse. Let's say there's an 80% rate, which is, again, really high. That would lead to about 5 kids coming from, of all bedwetters, what percent of them come from abused versus non-abused kids? So this is our base rate of abuse, right? So we've got 94 kids who are not abused. Let's say there's the 50% rate of nighttime bedwetting in non-abused kids. You can see then we'd have 47 kids who are still wetting the bed, 47 3-year-olds. So out of all kids who show nighttime bedwetting, we've got the 47 non-abused, 5, we'll say 5 for the abused. We've got 52 bedwetters. 47 out of 52 of them have no history of abuse. So out of all bedwetters, you can see if you plug in even these very generous numbers, like the probability is that they're coming from the non-abuse rate, the non-abuse group. And we could do the same thing with any other symptom that you wanted to plug in. You could plug in the rates of self-injury for abused versus non-abused, taking into account the base rate of abuse. You're going to see that most girls who commit self-injury, in fact, were not abused. So I think this is a lot of the problem, though, of where we end up with these false suspicions, is that people aren't taking into account base rates. Let me page ahead here, and I'm gonna, like I said, make these slides available. If anyone wants more info on interviewing kids, here's a couple books that I put up, and I'll share these with you. So if you don't want to write them down, but about best practice guidelines in interviewing kids. The way that parents sometimes talk to their kids, we know from the research, it tends to be very leading. And I just published a large scale review article on that topic with one of my colleagues, if anyone's interested in that. So parents' influence on their children. How do parents talk to their kids? What kind of an effect does it have on kids' memory? And to what extent can we undo that later on with a good, proper interview? And the answer is actually that kids are quite susceptible to parent influence, I should say, not just maternal influence, but the influence by any adult in the informal setting. And once kids are interviewed suggestively, they tend to go on and be pretty consistent with the story, and they embellish and they fill in the gaps in their memory report. So that's kind of false allegations, or what I think are false allegations, false concerns with kids. And then with adults, again, I wanted just to mention that I'm seeing a whole lot of repressed memory claims now. And so I think with the claims of repressed memories, according to all of the research by cognitive psychologists, the bottom line conclusion is that there's really no good scientific evidence to support repressed memory. Yes, there may be times where we don't think of something for a long time. Yes, kids sometimes never tell about abuse and come forward many, many years later. But what's problematic are the people who are watching TikTok, who are going to therapists and having things like almost like hypnosis done to help them figure out why, despite that they come from this great family, are they showing self-injury? And then they end up recovering a repressed memory during that therapy. Those are kind of the problematic cases. So to close, with adult cases, with alleged memory for adults, I think we can conceptualize the case in the very same way if we have a case of repressed memory. And by the way, there is also some research, not just that we can go a long time without thinking about it, but that we can like kind of cast something that like maybe we hadn't thought about in forever, that and something cues the memory and we go, oh wow, wait a second. You know what? I was actually abused. I never even thought of that as abuse, right? So there's evidence for that type of thing, but not for like hey, I have weight problems, I have intimacy problems, I have suicidal thoughts. Like that, in my opinion, would go under this like suggestibility option right here. Sorry, I always am victim to the over planning fallacy and thought I could get through all these slides. So pardon that I'm kind of paging ahead, but I wanted just to let you know this one last thing that I found very concerning. In a recent study that I did with some of my collaborators about a year and a half ago, we conducted a large-scale national survey in the US asking a random sample of adult Americans if they believe in repressed memory. And by repressed memory, is we were saying like that they completely they did not have access to the memory, like they were completely aware of it, and that they can do something to remember it. And the rates were shockingly high. Americans agree that repressed memory really happens. So 98% of our sample said that yes, memories can be repressed. And a big trend going on right now too, from what I've been able to see, is kind of this concept that the body keeps the score. 77% of people agreed that you can have some kind of issue in your body, like say a bad hip, or like a trouble hearing even. And the reason for these physical ailments is that you've stored a body memory. And so like your hip pain, we need to get to the bottom of that. And that could be a memory from you being sexually abused that you repressed when you were 5. So let's have you, undergo this recovered memory therapy. Why do we have false cases? Well, we have plenty of true ones, yes, but hopefully in this little, I feel like I was only able to touch on these concepts quite briefly, that if you weren't already convinced, which I'm guessing you all have healthy skepticism, but that we really need to be careful with some of the things that we do with kids. And I don't think we need to look any further than some of the things we've done to kids over the years in medicine and in psychology, like giving little kids Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup that contained cannabis and heroin in the 1800s to help calm the baby, or the case of lobotomy. So I'd better end there. Thank you so much for your attention. I would love to open things up for discussion if anyone has a discussion point after that little marathon of research.
Dr. London,
Thank
I just
you.
want to say on behalf of the department, thank you so much. Such important information, and thank you for your willingness to share your slides. I think Robin will probably be reaching out to you for that. And
Yeah.
My apologies for the introduction snafu on the.
Not at all.
So we have you all about 5 minutes for questions. So either I'll watch the chat if you want to put them in there, or just unmute and ask Dr. London questions or comments.
And again, apologies, I truly meant to leave more time, and I can stick around a little after if anyone else wants to, or if my email's up on the slide, and I'd be very happy to email or talk, since I meant to leave more time.
Dr. London, thank you so much for your great talk. You mentioned a connection between EMDR and recovered memories. Do you mind elaborating on that?
Yeah, so with EMDR, I think the evidence that I've seen on like the effectiveness of EMDR has to do with when people have PTSD and they can't get these intrusive thoughts out of their head, that it can basically help help them, I don't know, cope or better be able to handle the memories. When I see EMDR in my cases where it's problematic, they're using these things for memory recovery. They're using them with people who don't present the way people who have experienced traumatic events tend to present, which is, I really wish I could stop thinking about this, but I can't. I have perseverative thoughts. So I'm seeing things like EMDR or NLP, neuro-linguistic processing, where they're using it to recover the memory. So it's more of like oh, you're presenting with all the symptoms of all the sexually abused kids, adults, people who were sexually abused as kids. Let's do this like hypnotic. So there are several studies now that have looked at like EMDR as like a suggestive mechanism. So I guess what I would say is, you know, I still think EMDR needs more research on its actual effectiveness, and it needs work that disentangles which aspects of it truly are helpful. But there seems to be really good, clear evidence that it does, in fact, like promote interhemispheric communication, you know. But yeah, I'm worried about it with false memories when it's used as, some people think it can be, it's this tool for like memory recovery, like hypnosis, you know.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. I think that's a great point. I think one of the issues that may arise is like when researchers like myself say, well, don't do this because that can be suggestive. Don't do that, that can be suggestive. Like, well, what do we do then, right? So I think researchers in my boat who are experimental people, we can't as much say what can work on truly traumatized people, but it's more like, well, don't do this in this context. It can have these like dangerous side effects. I think I'm 2 hours ahead of you. I'm on Eastern time. You guys are at the low point of my circadian rhythm at about 1 p.m. I'm post lunch. I'm always ready for either a coffee or a nap.
Well, Dr. London, thank you again so much. Several
My
comments
pleasure.
from other folks thanking you. Any other questions before we leave, or comments? All right, I just want to remind you, Robin has put the information for the CEUs and to fill out the, what do you call that thing? The evaluation. Thank you. All right. Thank you so much again, Dr. London.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. And thank you everyone for all your time and for tuning in. It was a pleasure to be here. All right. Take care,
Bye.
everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.